October 1939. 10,000 people lined the streets of Edinburgh to honour fallen soldiers. But here's what doesn't make sense. They were burying their enemies. It's October 16th, 1939. The world's been at war for exactly 6 weeks. Most people in Britain are still trying to wrap their heads around what that even means. There haven't been any bombs on London yet, no air raid sirens wailing through the night, no children evacuated to the countryside. The war feels distant, like something happening somewhere else, to someone else. And then 12 German bombers appear over Scotland's Firth of Forth, and suddenly the war isn't distant anymore. It's right there, screaming through the sky at 300 miles per hour. These aren't just any bombers, they're Junkers Ju-88s. Brand new, fast, deadly. Germany's showing off what they can do. The targets are Royal Navy ships anchored in the Forth. HMS Southampton, HMS Edinburgh, HMS Mohawk. Big warships, sitting ducks if the Germans can get to them. And for a few terrifying minutes, it looks like they might. The bombers come in low and fast, dropping their payloads, and chaos erupts. Explosions, anti-aircraft fire, sailors scrambling. 16 British sailors will die in this attack, and dozens more will be wounded. The ships take damage. This is real, this is war coming home. But the RAF isn't going to just let this happen. Spitfires from 602 and 603 squadrons, local boys flying out of bases right there in Scotland, they scramble into the sky. And what happens next becomes the stuff of legend. These pilots, some of them barely out of their teens, they tear into those German bombers like they've been waiting their whole lives for this moment. Dogfights erupt over the Forth, machine guns chattering, planes twisting and diving, and when the smoke clears, 2 of those Junkers Ju-88s are going down. One crashes near Prestonpans, the other ditches in the water off Portobello, a coastal suburb of Edinburgh. And inside those planes are young men, just like the RAF pilots shooting at them. Young men who, minutes ago, were the enemy, the invaders, the threat. Now they're just broken bodies in the water, some dead, some dying, some clinging to wreckage and hoping somebody pulls them out before the cold kills them. The bodies of 2 German airmen wash up near Portobello, Kurt Seidel and August Schleicher. The records get fuzzy on their exact ages. Some say Kurt was 19, others say he might have been 26. August was somewhere between 17 and 22. Doesn't really matter, does it? They were kids, somebody's sons, and now they're dead on a Scottish beach, thousands of miles from home, in a war that's barely started. 2 others survive, Hauptmann Helmut Pohler and Lieutenant Hans Storp. They're pulled from the water, wounded, taken prisoner. They become some of the first German POWs of the entire air war. And they're terrified, not just because they're hurt, not just because they're prisoners, but because they have no idea what's about to happen to them. They've been taught that the British are the enemy, that they're brutal, that prisoners don't fare well. So when they're taken to a hospital in Edinburgh Castle, they're expecting the worst. But something else is happening on the streets of Edinburgh. Something nobody, least of all those German POWs lying in hospital beds, could have predicted. Remember? Britain hadn't been bombed yet. The Blitz hadn't happened. These people hadn't learned to hate. The bodies of Kurt Seidel and August Schleicher are in a morgue somewhere in Edinburgh. Enemy dead. Invaders who came to kill British sailors and got killed instead. The easy thing, the expected thing, would be to bury them quietly somewhere, unmarked graves, forgotten. That's what happens to enemy dead, right? Especially enemy dead carrying Nazi flags, flying planes with swastikas painted on the tails. This is 1939. Hitler's been making threats for years. Everyone knows where this is headed. So why would anyone in Edinburgh care about giving these boys a proper burial? But that's where this story stops making sense in the best possible way. Mothers in Edinburgh, women who have sons in the RAF, who have husbands in the Navy, who know exactly what war costs, they start talking. In shops, in churches, on street corners, and what they're saying surprises even them. These German boys lying dead, they're somebody's sons too. Somewhere in Germany there's a mother waiting for news, hoping her boy is safe, praying he'll come home. And these Scottish mothers, they can't bear the thought of adding cruelty to that grief. The pressure starts building, not from politicians, not from military brass, from everyday people, workers, families, mothers who understand loss in a way that transcends nationality. They start demanding that Kurt Seidel and August Schleicher receive full military honours. And when I say full military honours, I mean everything. Coffins draped in flags, yes, Nazi flags, pipers, salutes, the whole ceremony. The kind of funeral you'd give your own fallen soldiers. Local officials don't know what to do with this. It's unprecedented. It's politically complicated. It could be seen as sympathizing with the enemy. But the pressure keeps mounting, and it's not coming from some radical fringe group. It's coming from the heart of the community. These are the people who make up Edinburgh, the backbone of the city, and they're united on this. These boys deserve dignity in death, enemy or not. Think about what that means for a second. This is 6 weeks into a war that everyone knows is going to be brutal. Poland has already fallen. France will be next. The writing is on the wall. This is going to be a long, bloody conflict. And yet these Scottish families, these mothers and fathers and workers, they're not thinking about revenge. They're not thinking about payback for the 16 sailors who died in that raid. They're thinking about 2 dead boys and the mothers who will grieve for them. It's easy to be merciful when you haven't been hurt yet. Maybe that's part of it. October 1939, Britain is still largely untouched. The real horror hasn't started. The bombs haven't fallen on London, the casualty lists haven't grown into the thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. These people don't know yet what this war will cost them. They still have the luxury of seeing the enemy as human. But maybe that's too cynical. Maybe what's happening in Edinburgh is something deeper than naivety. Maybe it's a conscious choice to hold on to humanity even when everything is pushing them toward hatred. Maybe these mothers know exactly what's coming and they're trying to preserve something precious before the war destroys it completely. And on October 21st, 1939, they get exactly what they asked for. 10,000 people showed up. Not to protest, not to jeer, to stand in complete silence. Picture this for a moment. Really picture it. You're standing on a street in Portobello, a quiet coastal neighbourhood of Edinburgh. It's late October, so there's that cold Scottish wind coming off the water, cutting right through your coat. The sky is grey, the kind of grey that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on everything. And the streets are packed. Not just a few dozen people, not a few hundred. 10,000 people have turned out for this funeral. Think about organising something like that in 1939. No social media, no mass communication, just word of mouth, conversations in pubs and shops, people telling their neighbours and friends, and somehow 10,000 people heard about this funeral and decided they needed to be there, they needed to bear witness. And here come the coffins. They're draped in Nazi flags, swastikas, the symbol of everything Britain is now at war against. The symbol that will, in just a few years, become synonymous with unspeakable horror. But right now, in October 1939, those flags are draped over 2 coffins being carried through the streets of Edinburgh by British soldiers. RAF soldiers. Men who might have friends who died in that raid. Men who are at war with Germany. And they're carrying these coffins with full military honours. The bagpipes start playing. Over the sea to sky. It's a traditional Scottish lament, mournful and beautiful, and it's echoing through these streets as 10,000 people stand in complete silence. Hats off, heads bowed, no one is shouting, no one is angry, they're just standing there, bearing witness to something that defies everything war is supposed to be. What are they thinking, these 10,000 people? Are they thinking about their own sons, their own husbands, their own fathers who might end up in coffins someday? Are they thinking about the mothers in Germany who will grieve for Kurt and August? Are they thinking about how strange it is to honour the enemy, how wrong it feels and how right at the same time? Or maybe they're not thinking at all. Maybe they're just feeling the weight of it, the sadness of it, the terrible waste of young lives cut short. Maybe in that moment, nationality doesn't matter. War doesn't matter. Politics don't matter. All that matters is that 2 young men are dead, and that deserves respect. And then come the wreaths. This is where it becomes almost impossible to hold it together. Anonymous Scottish mothers, women who will never be named, who wanted no recognition, who just needed to do this, they sent flowers, wreaths with messages pinned to them. And these messages, they cut right to the bone. To 2 brave airmen from the mother of an airman. Think about what that means. A Scottish mother who has a son in the RAF, who might lose that son to German guns any day now, she's sending flowers to dead German airmen. She's calling them brave. She's acknowledging that they were doing the same thing her son is doing. Following orders, fighting for their country, believing they're on the right side. She's seeing past the uniforms, past the flags, past the war itself, and recognizing that these boys were just boys. that they were brave in the same way her son is brave, that they died doing something dangerous and terrifying, just like her son might die. And instead of hating them for being the enemy, she's honouring them for being human. Another wreath reads, "With the deep sympathy of Scottish mothers." Not one mother, mothers, plural. This isn't some isolated act of kindness from one unusually compassionate woman. This is a community of women who have looked at war and decided that some things matter more than nationality. That grief is grief, no matter what flag you die under. That somewhere in Germany, mothers are waiting for news about Kurt and August, and the least they can do is make sure those boys are honoured. There's something about mothers and war that cuts through all the noise. Mothers know what it costs. They're the ones who raise the sons who go off to fight. They're the ones who get the telegram, who open the door to see the officer standing there with his hat in his hands, who collapse in the doorway when they hear the news. They know that every soldier who dies is somebody's son. And these Scottish mothers, they can't separate the dead German airmen from their own sons. They see Kurt and August, and they see their boys, and they can't bear to let them be buried without honour. Reverend James Rossi Brown officiates the funeral, and he doesn't just bury these boys and move on. He takes it upon himself to write letters. To Kurt Seidel's mother, to August Schleicher's mother. He writes to them in Germany, enemy territory, and he tells them that their sons were given full military honours by the people of Edinburgh, that they weren't forgotten, that they weren't dumped in unmarked graves, that they were respected and mourned. Can you imagine receiving that letter? You're a mother in Germany, you've just learned your son is dead, shot down over Britain, and you're bracing yourself for the worst. For news that his body was desecrated, that he was treated like garbage, that the enemy showed no mercy even in death. And instead, you get a letter from a Scottish reverend telling you that 10,000 people line the streets to honour your boy, that mothers in Scotland sent flowers, that he was buried with dignity and grace. What does that letter mean to a grieving mother? What does it change? It doesn't bring her son back. It doesn't end the war. It doesn't erase the pain, but it tells her that somewhere, even in enemy territory, people saw her son as a human being, that he wasn't just a casualty, a statistic, a nameless enemy, that he mattered, that his death was mourned by people who had no reason to mourn him except that they were human, and so was he. Reverend Brown didn't have to do that. He could have buried the boys and considered his duty done, but he went further. He reached across enemy lines, across the divide of war, and offered comfort to mothers he would never meet. And in doing so, he became part of something larger than himself. Part of a moment that transcended the war and spoke to something eternal about human compassion. This isn't some government propaganda move. There are no newsreels being made, no political points being scored. This is just people being human when they have every reason not to be. The war has just started. They don't know about the Blitz yet. They don't know about the concentration camps. They don't know about the years of horror that are coming. They just see two dead kids and decide that matters more than nationality. But you have to wonder, did they regret it later? When the bombs started falling on London, when British cities were reduced to rubble, when the casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands, did those Scottish mothers look back on that funeral and feel foolish? Did they feel like they'd extended mercy to an enemy that would show none in return? Maybe some of them did. Maybe some of them became bitter, hardened by the years of war that followed. Maybe they looked at those graves in Portobello Cemetery and felt like they'd been naive, like they'd been taken advantage of, like they'd wasted their compassion on boys who represented a regime that would go on to commit unspeakable atrocities. Or maybe they held onto it. Maybe they looked back on that day and felt proud. Proud that they'd chosen mercy when they could have chosen hatred. Proud that they'd honoured the dead when they could have desecrated them. Proud that they'd been human when the world was pushing them to be monsters. Because here's where this story gets even more unbelievable. Because the British pilots who shot them down were about to walk into their hospital room. Hauptmann Helmut Pohler and Lieutenant Hans Storp are lying in hospital beds in Edinburgh Castle. They're wounded, they're prisoners, and they're terrified. They don't speak much English. They have no idea what's going to happen to them. In their minds, they're at the mercy of the enemy, and the enemy has no reason to show mercy. They shot at British ships. They killed British sailors. They came as invaders. Why would anyone treat them kindly? POWs in World War II faced uncertain fates. The Geneva Conventions existed, sure, but they were just words on paper. What mattered was how individual nations, individual camps, individual guards chose to interpret them. Pola and Storp have heard stories. Every soldier has. Stories about POWs being mistreated, beaten, starved, worse. They don't know what to believe, but they're preparing for the worst. And then the door opens, and in walk the RAF pilots who shot them down. Think about that moment. Really think about it. You're a German airman lying wounded in an enemy hospital, and the men who nearly killed you just walked into your room. What are you expecting? Gloating? Threats? Interrogation? At best, cold indifference. At worst, outright hostility. But that's not what happens. These RAF pilots, they don't come to gloat. They come as pilots, as equals. They come because they understand something that most people never will, that combat between pilots is different. It's personal and impersonal at the same time. You're trying to kill each other in the air, but once you're on the ground, once the fight is over, you're just aviators. You share something that transcends the war. You know what it's like to be up there, alone in a machine, with your life depending on split-second decisions and a little bit of luck. There's a strange fraternity among fighter pilots, even enemy pilots. They respect each other in a way that ground troops often can't, because flying combat is so intense, so dangerous, so isolating, that only someone who's done it can truly understand. The RAF pilots walking into that hospital room, they've done exactly what Pola and Storp have done. They've climbed into a plane, taken off into hostile skies, and put their lives on the line. The only difference is which side they're fighting for. So they talk, as much as the language barrier allows. They use gestures, simple words, shared understanding, and somehow the news of the funeral comes up. The RAF pilots tell Pola and Storp about what happened, about the procession through Portobello, about the 10,000 people who showed up, about the bagpipes and the wreaths and the messages from Scottish mothers, about the full military honours given to their fellow airmen, Kurt Seidel and August Schleicher. And you can see it in Pola's face. The shock, the disbelief, and then something else, something deeper. Gratitude. Overwhelming gratitude. He's been expecting cruelty, he's been bracing himself for it, and instead he's being told that his comrades, his fellow airmen who died in that raid, were honoured. Not just buried, but honoured, with pipers and flags and thousands of people bearing witness. In a country they came to attack, by people they came to kill, they were given the kind of funeral reserved for heroes. And Hauptmann Pola, this German officer who hours ago was bombing British ships, he says something that reveals everything about what this moment means. We are all pilots together. 5 words. That's all it takes. The war doesn't disappear, the conflict doesn't end. Germany and Britain are still enemies, and they will be for 6 more brutal years. But in that hospital room, for just a moment, the humanity underneath the war becomes impossible to ignore. These men recognize each other. Not as German and British, not as enemies, but as pilots, as men doing the same dangerous job on opposite sides of a line drawn by politicians and history. Pola is moved, deeply moved. The RAF pilots can see it in his face, in the way he struggles to find words across the language barrier. He expected hatred. He expected, at best, cold professionalism. Instead, he's been shown a kindness that humbles him. His fellow airmen, his comrades who died in that raid, were honoured by the very people they came to attack. And now the men who shot him down are visiting him as equals, as brothers in arms separated only by the accidents of birth and allegiance. What does that do to a man? What does it mean to be shown mercy when you expect cruelty? Does it change how you see the enemy? Does it complicate the simple narratives of us versus them? Good versus evil? Does it make the war harder to fight, or does it give you something to hold on to, some proof that even in the worst of times, humanity can survive? Storp feels it too. You can see it in the accounts. 2 German airmen, wounded and scared, suddenly confronted with the fact that their enemies are capable of extraordinary compassion. That the people they came to kill chose instead to honour their dead. It's too much to process, too big to fit into the framework they've been given for understanding this war. And that's what makes this story so devastating. This happened in October 1939, before the Blitz, before the concentration camps were fully known, before years of brutality hardened hearts on both sides. This kind of gesture, this kind of mercy, it became nearly impossible as the war dragged on. Every bombing raid on London, every report of Nazi atrocities, every year of grinding warfare, it made compassion like this unthinkable. By 1940, by 1941, by 1945, nobody in Britain was holding funerals like this for German dead. How could they? After everything that happened, after all the horror and death and suffering, that early compassion got buried under the weight of war, which makes October 1939 even more precious and more tragic, because it shows what we're capable of before we learn to hate completely. It shows that moment, right at the beginning, when people still remember that the enemy is human. That moment before the atrocities pile up, before the grief becomes too heavy, before mercy starts to feel like betrayal. Those graves in Portobello Cemetery still overlook the 4th today. You can visit them. Stand where 10,000 people once stood in silence, honouring enemies, refusing to let war strip away their humanity. The headstones are still there, marking the final resting place of Kurt Seidel and August Schleicher, 2 young men who died far from home in the first days of a war that would consume the world. And standing there, you can't help but ask, how many moments like this happened that we never heard about? How many small acts of mercy, of recognition, of humanity occurred in the chaos of war and were lost to history? How many times did soldiers on opposite sides look at each other and see not enemies but just other men trapped in the same nightmare? Because here's what history doesn't usually tell you. This wasn't an isolated incident. It's unusual, yes, remarkable, yes, but it's not completely unique. Early in wars, before the worst atrocities pile up, before the hatred becomes institutional, there are these flickers of humanity. These moments where people on both sides pause and remember that they're killing other people. In World War I, you had the Christmas truce of 1914. British and German soldiers climbing out of their trenches on Christmas Day, meeting in no man's land, sharing cigarettes and chocolate, playing football, singing carols. Men who hours before were trying to kill each other, suddenly remembering that they were all far from home, all cold and scared and tired, all just trying to survive. And then Christmas ended, and they went back to the trenches, and they went back to killing each other. But for one day, they chose to be human instead of soldiers. In the early days of the air war, before the bombing campaigns became total and brutal, there was a strange chivalry among pilots. They'd salute each other in the air. If they shot someone down and saw them bail out safely, they'd circle overhead to make sure they survived. There are accounts of German pilots dropping wreaths over British airfields where they'd shot down an enemy ace. A sign of respect for a worthy opponent. It was a throwback to an older kind of warfare, one where honour mattered, where you could kill your enemy and still respect him. But those moments fade. They always fade. By 1940, the Blitz had begun. German bombers were pounding London night after night. Civilians were dying by the thousands. Children were being pulled from the rubble. Entire neighbourhoods reduced to ash and rubble. The idea of honouring dead German airmen became unthinkable. They weren't brave young men anymore. They were the enemy, the ones dropping bombs on homes and schools and hospitals. They were the ones killing children in their beds. How do you extend mercy to men who do that? By 1941, the Nazi death camps were in full operation, and the reports were starting to filter out. The scale of the horror became impossible to ignore. Millions of people, Jews, Roma, political prisoners, anyone the Nazis deemed undesirable, being systematically murdered. How do you extend mercy to an enemy engaged in systematic genocide? How do you honour soldiers who fight for a regime that's building factories of death? By 1945, after 6 years of total war, after millions dead, after cities reduced to rubble, after the full scope of Nazi atrocities became known, that early compassion was a distant memory. German POWs were still treated according to the Geneva Conventions, but nobody was throwing them military funerals with bagpipes and wreaths from grieving mothers. The well of mercy had run dry, and who could blame anyone for that? Which is why October 24, 1939 matters so much. It's a glimpse of what could have been if the war hadn't become what it became. It's a window into a moment when ordinary people looked at the enemy and still saw human beings. when Scottish mothers could imagine the grief of German mothers and couldn't bear to add to it, when RAF pilots could visit the men they'd shot down and recognise them as fellow aviators, when an entire community could turn out to honour dead enemies because dignity and death mattered more than nationality. It's also a reminder of how fragile that compassion is, how quickly it can be eroded by violence and suffering and hatred. Those same Scottish mothers who sent wreaths to German airmen in October 1939, by 1940 they were watching German bombers fly overhead on their way to devastate British cities. How many of them regretted that kindness? How many of them felt like they'd been naive, like they'd extended mercy to an enemy that would show none in return? And maybe they did feel that way. Maybe they looked back on that funeral and saw it as a mistake, a moment of weakness in the face of an implacable foe. Or maybe they held onto it as proof that even in war, even in the worst of times, there's still a choice. That hatred isn't inevitable, that you can acknowledge the humanity of your enemy without surrendering, without giving up the fight, without betraying your own side. Because that's the tension at the heart of this story. The people of Edinburgh who honoured those German airmen, they didn't stop fighting the war. The RAF pilots who visited Poli and Storp in the hospital, they went right back to flying combat missions against Germany. The mothers who sent wreaths, they still prayed every night for their sons to come home safely, even if that meant more dead Germans. The compassion they showed didn't make them pacifists, it didn't make them weak, it just made them human. And maybe that's the lesson, if there is one, that you can fight a war and still refuse to dehumanize your enemy, that you can kill in combat and still honor the dead, that you can be at war with a nation and still recognize that the soldiers on the other side are people with families and hopes and fears just like yours. It's a hard balance. Maybe an impossible balance, especially as a war drags on and the casualties mount and the atrocities multiply. But for one day in October 1939, the people of Edinburgh managed it. Hauptmann Helmut Poehler survived the war. He went on to spend years as a POW, moved from camp to camp, eventually returning to Germany after the war ended. In interviews later in life, he talked about that funeral, about the visit from the RAF pilots, about the shock and gratitude he felt. He said it changed how he saw the British, how he understood the war. It didn't make him doubt his country or his service, but it gave him something to hold on to in the dark years that followed. A reminder that not everyone on the other side was a monster. That mercy still existed, even in war. Lieutenant Hans Storp had a similar trajectory. Years in POW camps, eventual repatriation, a life lived in the shadow of the war. And he too carried the memory of that day, of lying in a hospital bed, terrified and having his enemies treat him with unexpected kindness, of learning that his fellow airmen were honoured rather than desecrated. It's the kind of memory that sticks with you, that shapes how you see the world. The RAF pilots who shot them down, they went on to become heroes of the Battle of Britain. They flew mission after mission, racked up kills, became aces. Some of them died in combat. Some of them survived the war and lived long lives. But you have to wonder if they ever thought back to that day in the hospital, talking to the German airmen they'd shot down, seeing them as people rather than targets, if it made the killing harder or easier or just more complicated. And the mothers who sent those wreaths, the ones with messages like, "To two brave airmen from the mother of an airman, they're anonymous. We don't know their names, we don't know what happened to their sons, we don't know if they survived the war or if they ended up on their own casualty lists." But their act of compassion is recorded, photographed, written about. It became part of the historical record, this small gesture of empathy from women who had every reason to hate. Reverend James Rosy Brown, who officiated the funeral and wrote to the mothers in Germany, he became a minor celebrity because of this. Not a hero exactly, but someone people remembered. Someone who, in a moment of chaos and fear, chose kindness. He didn't have to write those letters. He could have buried the boys and moved on. But he took the time to reach across enemy lines and offer comfort to grieving mothers. It's the kind of thing that seems small in the moment, but echoes through history. The graves themselves, they became a kind of pilgrimage site. Not officially, not with any fanfare, but people started visiting them, laying flowers, standing in silence. Even decades later, even after the war ended and the world moved on, people remembered. They remembered what happened in Portobello in October 1939, when a community chose to honour rather than hate. And maybe that's the real power of this story. Not just what happened, but what it represents. The choice to see humanity in the enemy. The choice to honor the dead regardless of the flag they fought under. The choice to extend mercy when mercy seems foolish, naive, even dangerous. It's a choice most people don't make, especially in war. But the people of Edinburgh made it, and it mattered. It mattered to Pola and Storp, lying wounded in that hospital. It mattered to the mothers in Germany who received those letters from Reverend Brown. It mattered to the RAF pilots who visited their former enemies and recognized them as equals. It mattered to the 10,000 people who stood in silence on those streets, bearing witness to something bigger than the war, bigger than the hatred, bigger than the fear. And it matters now, 8.5 decades later, because it reminds us that even in the darkest times, people are capable of extraordinary compassion. That war doesn't have to strip away every shred of humanity. That the enemy is still human, still deserving of basic dignity, still somebody's son or daughter or parent or friend. It's a hard truth to hold on to when the world is burning, when the casualties are mounting, when the atrocities are piling up, but it's true nonetheless. Those graves in Portobello Cemetery, they overlook the Firth of Forth where Kurt Seidel and August Schleicher died, where their plane went down, where their war ended. And if you stand there today, looking out over that water, you can almost imagine what it was like. The roar of engines, the chatter of machine guns, the explosion as the plane hit the water. And then the silence, the cold water, the bodies washing up on the beach, the community gathering to decide what to do with enemy dead. They chose mercy, they chose dignity, they chose to honor 2 young men who came as invaders and died as someone's sons. And in doing so, they created a moment that transcends the war, that speaks to something deeper than politics or nationality or even survival. They created a moment that reminds us what we're capable of, at our best, even in the worst of times. That's what makes this story so powerful and so tragic, because it shows what was possible in October 1939, before the war got worse, before the hatred became total, before mercy started to feel like betrayal. And it raises the question, could we do it again? If faced with the same choice, would we extend that same compassion? Would we honor our enemies in death, even knowing they came to kill us? Would we see their humanity, even in the midst of war? Most of us will never have to answer that question. Most of us will never be in a situation where we're asked to honor the enemy, to extend mercy when vengeance seems more justified. But the people of Edinburgh were asked that question in October 1939, and they answered it with bagpipes and wreaths and 10,000 silent witnesses. They answered it with a funeral that humbled their enemies and reminded the world that even in war, some things are sacred. And those graves are still there, still overlooking the Forth, still asking us the same question. What would we do? What would we choose? Would we have the courage to be kind when kindness seems foolish? Would we have the strength to see the humanity in our enemies? Because that's what courage looks like sometimes. Not charging into battle, not standing up to power, not fighting against impossible odds. Sometimes courage looks like a mother sending flowers to a dead enemy airman. Sometimes it looks like a reverend writing letters to grieving families in enemy territory. Sometimes it looks like 10,000 people standing in silence, honoring the dead regardless of what flag they fought under. That's the story of October 24, 1939. The story of a funeral that shouldn't have happened but did. The story of compassion in the face of war. The story of ordinary people making an extraordinary choice. And it's a story that still matters, still resonates, still challenges us to be better than our worst instincts. Because in the end, that's what those Scottish mothers understood. That's what Reverend Brown understood. That's what those 10,000 silent witnesses understood. That war doesn't have to destroy everything. That mercy doesn't make you weak. That honoring the dead, even enemy dead, isn't betrayal. It's the most human thing you can do. What stories of unexpected humanity from war has your family passed down? Share them below.